Picture this. A blind ex-policeman stands in a courtroom, his loyal K9 guide dog by his side. The atmosphere is thick with tension, and everyone is waiting for his final words. But when his dog suddenly reacts in a way no one could have anticipated, the entire trial takes a shocking turn. This is a story of trust, intuition, and the extraordinary bond between a man and his dog. Stay tuned to witness how a blind man's faith in his companion uncovers the truth. The courtroom was a theater of muted whispers and darting glances as Jack Sullivan entered, his movements deliberate yet confident. Jack was a retired police officer, once hailed as one of the most skilled detectives in the city, but now life had dealt him an unimaginable blow. He had lost his sight in an accident during his last case. Despite this, Jack's presence commanded respect, his demeanor resolute. Beside him walked Max, his faithful German shepherd, who had transitioned from a K9 officer to Jack's trusted guide dog. Their partnership had grown even deeper in the years following Jack's retirement. Max wasn't just his eyes, he was his protector, his constant companion, and the one being Jack could always rely on. Jack's life had taken another cruel twist. He was now on trial, accused of a serious crime. The case had divided opinions, with many struggling to reconcile the accusations with the decorated officer's reputation. Today, the trial had reached a pivotal moment. Jack had requested that Max be allowed in court, not just as his guide, but because he believed his dog might hold the key to his defense. The judge, a stern yet fair woman, granted the request with a touch of skepticism. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, "this is an unusual allowance. I trust you'll explain the relevance of your request." "Thank you, Your Honor," Jack replied, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Max and I have been through everything together. He's not just a dog, he's my partner. And I trust his instincts more than anything." As Max led Jack to his seat, the dog's keen eyes scanned the room, his nose twitching slightly. The courtroom fell silent as everyone watched. Jack reached down, running his hand along Max's back, a gesture of reassurance for them both. Then it happened. Max, usually calm and composed, tensed. A low growl rumbled in his throat, his gaze locking onto a man seated at the prosecutor's table. The unexpected reaction sent ripples of shock through the room. Jack's head tilted, his expression serious. "Max," he murmured, his tone questioning. The dog's behavior wasn't random, it was deliberate. What had Max sensed? The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of tension as the unexpected growl from Max broke the silence. Jack's fingers instinctively tightened on the leash, sensing his dog's unusual alertness. The judge rapped her gavel lightly, calling for order. "Mr. Sullivan," the judge's tone softened but carried a note of concern. "Can you explain what's happening with your dog?" Jack hesitated. "Your Honor, Max has been trained to detect danger. He's never behaved like this without reason. I trust his instincts." The courtroom exchanged uneasy glances. The prosecutor, Mr. Langston, stood with a smirk. "With all due respect to Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge, "are we really allowing a dog's growl to sway legal proceedings?" Jack lifted his head, though his unseeing eyes stared straight ahead. "Max has saved my life more times than I can count," he said firmly. "If he's reacting, it's because something's not right." Max's growl softened into a low whine, his body tense, his gaze fixed on a man sitting a few rows behind the prosecution table. The man, dressed in a crisp gray suit, shifted uncomfortably under the dog's intense scrutiny. The judge, intrigued, turned her gaze to the man. "Sir," she addressed him, "is there something you'd like to share?" The man, startled by the attention, stammered, No, Your Honor, I'm just an observer who seems to have caught the attention of a highly trained K9, Jack interjected, his voice calm but pointed. The courtroom fell silent again, the air thick with curiosity and unease. Max's history wasn't a mystery to anyone familiar with Jack's career. As part of the police force, Max had been trained to detect narcotics, explosives, and even human emotions like fear and aggression. His instincts had been honed over years of rigorous training and fieldwork. Jack knew that Max's reaction wasn't arbitrary. It was a signal. The prosecutor tried to redirect the focus. "Let's not lose sight of the matter at hand," he said. "Mr. Sullivan is on trial for obstructing justice and tampering with evidence. This is not the time for distractions about what a dog might or might not have sensed." Jack remained silent, his hand steady on Max's harness, but internally, his mind raced. He recalled Max's past alerts, each one leading to a breakthrough or saving lives. Was it possible that Max had detected something about the man in the grey suit? The judge addressed Jack again. "Mr. Sullivan, your request to have Max here was highly unconventional, but I allowed it out of respect for your service. Do you believe his reaction is relevant to your defense?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jack said confidently. "Max has an extraordinary ability to perceive what others might miss. I don't know what he's sensing, but I believe it's important." The judge considered this. "Mr. Langston," she said, turning to the prosecutor, "do you object to exploring this matter further?" Langston, visibly irritated, waved his hand dismissively. "If it'll satisfy the court, let's address the dog's behavior, but I don't see how it relates to the charges against Mr. Sullivan." The judge nodded. "Very well, Mr. Sullivan, I'll allow you to explain Max's reaction, but I warn you, this must be directly relevant to the case." Jack nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." He turned his head slightly, speaking to Max in a soft, commanding tone. "Max, sit." The dog immediately obeyed, his body still alert but now seated beside Jack. Jack's fingers brushed the fur on Max's neck, grounding himself as he spoke. "Max has a history of detecting things no one else notices," Jack began. "On more than one occasion, he's alerted me to concealed weapons, hidden drugs, even lies during interrogations. He can sense tension, fear, and guilt. I can't explain how. It's just who he is." The judge leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. "And you believe he's sensing something now?" "Yes," Jack said firmly, "and I believe it's coming from that man." He pointed in the general direction of the man in the grey suit. The man's face turned pale as the attention of the entire courtroom shifted to him. "Your Honor," Jack continued, "I request that this man be identified and questioned. If Max is reacting to him, there's a reason, and that reason might be critical to my defense." The judge hesitated, clearly weighing the unusual request. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for her decision. "Bailiff," the judge finally said, "please escort the man in the grey suit to the witness stand." The bailiff approached the man, who appeared increasingly nervous. As he was led to the stand, Max's eyes never wavered, his body coiled like a spring. "State your name for the record," the judge instructed. The man hesitated before speaking. "Michael Reyes," he said, his voice barely audible. "Mr. Reyes," the judge said, her tone firm, "you are now under oath. I advise you to answer truthfully. Do you have any connection to this case or the defendant?" Reyes's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the stand. I'm just here to observe," he stammered. Jack's instincts told him otherwise. Max's reaction wasn't coincidental, and Jack was determined to uncover the truth. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. All eyes were on Michael Reyes, who now sat uneasily in the witness stand, his knuckles white as they gripped the edge. Max's piercing gaze remained fixed on him, the low growl from earlier now replaced by an unsettling silence. The judge's voice broke the tension. "Mr. Reyes, you've stated that you are here as an observer, but Mr. Sullivan's service dog has shown an unusual reaction toward you. Given Mr. Sullivan's history and Max's training, the court finds it necessary to investigate further. I advise you to be forthcoming in your responses." Michael swallowed hard. I don't know what this is about," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Jack's voice, calm but cutting, broke through. "Max doesn't react to just anyone, Mr. Reyes. I'd like to know why you're here today. Are you connected to the prosecutor's office, the police, or something else?" Reyes hesitated, his eyes darting toward the prosecutor, Langston, who was now shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Your Honor," Langston interjected, his tone sharp, "this is an unwarranted distraction. Mr. Reyes's presence here has no bearing on this case. We're allowing a dog's behavior to dictate legal proceedings, which is absurd." But the judge held up her hand, silencing him. "Mr. Langston, you argued earlier that addressing this behavior would satisfy the court's concerns. We are now addressing it. Please refrain from interruptions." Jack leaned forward slightly, his sightless eyes directed at Reyes. "You're not just an observer, are you?" Reyes's breathing quickened, and his shoulders slumped. I work for a private investigation firm," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The judge rapped her gavel again. "Order. Mr. Reyes, elaborate. What is your role and why are you here today?" I was hired to dig up information on Mr. Sullivan," Reyes confessed, his voice trembling. "By Mr. Langston." Langston shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I object." "This is irrelevant and an unfounded accusation." The judge's sharp glare cut him off. "Sit down, Mr. Langston." "Mr. Reyes." "Continue." Reyes sighed, visibly deflating. "I was tasked with uncovering anything that could discredit Mr. Sullivan. My instructions were clear. Make sure the prosecution's case was airtight." Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "And what did you find, Mr. Reyes?" Reyes hesitated, his face pale. "Nothing. At least, nothing incriminating. That's why I'm here today. I was told to observe, just in case. Something useful came up during the trial." The judge's face hardened. "Mr. Langston, is this true? Did you hire a private investigator to gather extraneous information on Mr. Sullivan?" Langston's face flushed. "Your Honor, it is common practice to ensure a thorough case. There's nothing unethical about hiring investigators, except when it's done with the intent to manipulate the outcome of a trial," the judge interjected, her voice icy. "This court does not condone such behavior, Mr. Langston. Consider this a warning." Jack's mind raced. Reyes's admission was significant, but it didn't explain Max's reaction. He addressed Reyes again. "Why did Max single you out? Is there something you're not telling us?" Reyes hesitated, sweat forming on his brow. I don't know, I swear." Max shifted beside Jack, his ears pricking forward as if listening intently. Jack's grip tightened on the leash. "Max isn't convinced, and neither am I." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Reyes, the court demands full transparency. If you withhold any relevant information, you could face charges of perjury and obstruction of justice." Reyes's shoulders slumped further. "There's one thing," he said reluctantly. "During my investigation, I was approached by someone, a man. He offered me money to fabricate evidence against Mr. Sullivan. I turned him down, but he was insistent, aggressive." The judge's expression darkened. "Who was this man?" Reyes shook his head. "I don't know his real name. He went by Dixon. He claimed to have connections that could make or break cases." The revelation sent another ripple through the courtroom. Jack's jaw tightened. "Dixon," he murmured, his mind flashing back to a name whispered during a past case involving police corruption. The judge addressed the court officers. "Find this Dixon, Mr. Reyes. You are to remain in custody until further notice. This court needs to ensure your safety and verify your claims." Reyes nodded meekly, relief and fear evident on his face. As the bailiff escorted Reyes from the stand, Max finally relaxed, his body language softening. Jack knelt beside him, running his hand through Max's fur. "Good boy," he whispered. But as the courtroom settled, Jack knew this was only the beginning. The mention of Dixon had cracked open a door that led to dangerous territory. The implications were clear. Someone wanted Jack silenced, and they were willing to go to great lengths to do it. The courtroom buzzed with a mixture of unease and anticipation as Reyes was escorted out. The judge called for a brief recess, allowing the tension to simmer while she reviewed the implications of the testimony. Jack sat quietly, his hand resting on Max's back, but his mind was far from still. Dixon. The name echoed in his thoughts like a siren. Jack had come across that name years ago, whispered in dark corners of precincts during his time on the force. It was tied to a shadowy figure who operated within the gray zones of law enforcement, manipulating evidence, witnesses, and even entire cases. Dixon was a ghost, known but never caught. As the court reconvened, Jack adjusted his posture, his sightless eyes turned toward the sound of the gavel. The judge's voice carried authority. "This court will not tolerate interference with the judicial process. The integrity of this trial has been called into question, and we will get to the bottom of it." The prosecutor, Langston, looked visibly shaken but composed himself enough to address the court. "Your Honor, while I disagree with Mr. Reyes's actions, there is no evidence tying me directly to this Dixon individual. I've never met or communicated with him." Jack's attorney, Sandra Mills, stood up. "Your Honor, while Mr. Langston denies involvement with Dixon, we must consider the possibility of a larger conspiracy at play. My client's history with uncovering corruption makes him a target." The judge nodded. "Ms. Mills, does your client have any insight into who this Dixon might be?" Jack leaned into the microphone, his voice steady but carrying a hint of frustration. "Your Honor, Dixon is no ordinary man. He's a fixer. If he's involved, it's because someone powerful wanted this case compromised. The judge frowned. "Do you have any evidence to support this claim, Mr. Sullivan?" Jack hesitated. "No concrete evidence, but Max's reaction to Reyes wasn't random. Max and I have been through enough to trust his instincts, especially when it comes to danger." The judge acknowledged his statement with a measured nod. "Understood. This court takes these matters seriously. We will proceed cautiously." Suddenly, the courtroom doors opened, and a court officer entered, approaching the bench with urgency. He handed the judge a piece of paper. Her expression darkened as she read it. "It appears we may have a lead on this Dixon." Officers tracked Reyes's last known communications, and one number matches an ongoing investigation into organized corruption. Gasps rippled through the room. The judge addressed the court. "This case has now expanded beyond its original scope. We must ensure the safety of all involved. I am placing this court under temporary adjournment while law enforcement investigates further. Mr. Sullivan, you are advised to remain under protective watch." Jack frowned. "Protective watch? What about Max and me? We've been through worse without guards." The judge's tone softened. "This is not a request, Mr. Sullivan. It's a precaution." As the gavel struck, signaling the adjournment, Jack felt a mix of frustration and unease. Being confined to protection wasn't his style. He preferred to face threats head-on. But he also knew this was no ordinary case. Jack sat in his modest apartment, the quiet hum of the city providing a faint backdrop. Max lay at his feet, his ears occasionally twitching as if sensing something amiss. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that events were spiraling out of control. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Max immediately sprang to attention, growling low. Jack moved cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on the collar where Max's ID and tracker were secured. "Who is it?" "Detective Ruiz," came the reply. Jack relaxed slightly. Ruiz was one of the few officers he trusted. Opening the door, he greeted the detective, who stepped in, her face lined with concern. "We've got a problem, Jack," she said, lowering her voice. "That lead on Dixon, it's bigger than we thought. He's tied to multiple cases of judicial tampering, and Reyes's testimony puts a target on your back. You're not safe here." Jack sighed. "When am I ever safe, Ruiz?" She gave a faint smile, but quickly grew serious. "This isn't a joke. We intercepted a message that suggests Dixon is already moving to cover his tracks, and you're on the list." Max growled softly, as if in agreement. Jack knelt beside him, stroking his head. "I'm not running. If Dixon wants to silence me, he'll have to face me." Ruiz frowned. "Jack, you're blind. You can't..." "Can't what?" Jack interrupted, his voice firm. "Survive. I've survived war, betrayal, and corruption. Max and I don't need sight to fight. We need information." Ruiz hesitated, then handed him a file. You didn't get this from me, but it might help. Names, locations, everything we've got on Dixon's network." Jack took the file, his fingers running over the Braille translations she'd thoughtfully included. "Thanks, Ruiz. This means a lot." She nodded. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Jack smirked. "Careful's not my style." As she left and Jack sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what lay ahead, Max nudged his hand, a silent reassurance that he wasn't alone. Together, they'd faced impossible odds before. This time would be no different. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the glow of a desk lamp. Jack sat at his small kitchen table, the file Detective Ruiz had handed him spread out before him. His fingers moved deftly over the Braille pages, absorbing every detail about Dixon's network. The more he read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Max lay at his feet, his head resting on Jack's boots, but his ears twitching at every faint sound from the hallway outside. Jack could feel the tension radiating from his partner. Max was a mirror of his own emotions, on edge, ready for anything. Jack leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "They think they can scare us, Max," he muttered, his voice low. Max raised his head, his sharp eyes meeting Jack's sightless ones. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." The file revealed Dixon's connections to several high-profile cases of corruption, implicating not only private investigators like Reyes, but also law enforcement officers, legal professionals, and even politicians. Jack's gut twisted as he realized how deep this web of influence stretched. It wasn't just about him. This was a system designed to protect criminals and silence anyone who got in the way. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. He froze, his hand instinctively moving to Max's collar. "Max," he whispered, his tone signaling caution. Max immediately rose, his body tense as he positioned himself between Jack and the door. "Who is it?" Jack called, his voice steady. "It's Ruiz," came the reply, but something in the tone made Jack pause. It wasn't quite right, too rushed, too anxious. Jack didn't move. "Ruiz, what's the code word?" he asked, his voice sharp. Ruiz had insisted on establishing a code word earlier, knowing the risks of someone impersonating her. There was silence on the other side of the door. Then a muffled curse. Jack's heart pounded as he grabbed Max's leash. "Time to move," he murmured, heading toward the fire escape in the back of the apartment. Max followed closely, his steps silent but purposeful. As they reached the window, Jack heard the sound of a lock being picked. Whoever was on the other side of that door wasn't wasting time. Jack slid the window open, the cold night air biting against his skin. Max jumped through first, landing on the metal grate with practiced ease. Jack followed, his movements quick and precise despite his lack of sight. Just as he closed the window behind him, the door burst open. Jack could hear heavy footsteps entering the apartment, the sound of drawers being yanked open and furniture being overturned. Whoever they were looking for something or someone. Jack and Max moved down the fire escape, their footsteps quiet against the metal. As they reached the alley below, Jack paused, listening intently. The city's sounds surrounded him, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, the faint chatter of pedestrians. But closer, he could hear the muffled voices of the intruders, now arguing among themselves. "They're not here," one of them growled. "Spread out." They couldn't have gotten far. Jack clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had to get to Ruiz or someone else he could trust, but staying in one place was too dangerous. He gave Max a signal, and the dog led him toward a side street, away from the main road where the intruders might have parked. As they moved through the shadows, Jack's thoughts turned to Ruiz. Had she been compromised? Or worse, was she being held by Dixon's people? The idea made his blood run cold. Ruiz was one of the few allies he had left, and he couldn't afford to lose her. Max suddenly stopped, his body rigid. Jack crouched beside him, his hand on the dog's shoulder. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Max's low growl was answer enough. Jack strained his ears and caught the faint sound of approaching footsteps. The intruders had split up, and one of them was heading in their direction. Jack felt the cold steel of his service weapon tucked into the holster beneath his jacket. He hadn't used it in years, not since the incident that had taken his sight, but he was prepared to defend himself and Max if it came to that. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. Jack could hear the intruder muttering, likely talking into a radio. "No sign of him," the man said. "He's blind. How far could he have gotten?" Jack smirked, a bitter sense of satisfaction washing over him. People always underestimated him because of his blindness. It was an advantage he'd learned to exploit. As the intruder moved on, Jack and Max slipped further into the alley, keeping to the shadows. They needed a plan, a way to turn the tables on Dixon and his network before things spiraled further out of control. Hours later, Jack and Max found refuge in an old safe house Jack had used during his time as an undercover officer. It was small and nondescript, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city. Jack locked the door behind them and leaned against it, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. Max sat beside him, his tail wagging faintly. Jack knelt down, resting his forehead against Max's. "Good boy," he murmured. "We'll figure this out. Together." As dawn broke, Jack sat at the small desk in the safe house, the file on Dixon spread out before him. He knew this fight was far from over, but with Max by his side and the truth starting to surface, he felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about exposing the corruption that had taken root in the system he'd once sworn to uphold. The early morning light filtered through the dusty blinds of the safe house, casting faint patterns on the worn wooden floor. Jack sat at the small desk, his fingers running over the Braille file Detective Ruiz had handed him. Max lay curled up near the door, his ears perked and his body poised, ready to react at the slightest sound. Jack's mind buzzed with the weight of what he'd uncovered so far. Dixon's criminal network wasn't just about intimidation and bribery. It extended into human trafficking, weapon smuggling, and a string of unsolved homicides that had been dismissed as gang-related. The scope was staggering, and the deeper Jack delved, the clearer it became that this wasn't the work of just one man. Dixon was part of something much larger. A sharp knock at the door startled Jack. Max sprang to his feet, Positioning himself protectively between Jack and the entrance, Jack reached for his weapon, his senses heightened. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady but firm. "It's Ruiz," came the reply, her voice low and urgent. Jack hesitated, the memory of the earlier break-in fresh in his mind. "What's the code word?" he demanded. "Valor," she said without hesitation. Jack relaxed slightly, signaling Max to stand down. He unlocked the door and opened it cautiously. Ruiz stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. She closed the door quickly behind her, scanning the room as though expecting someone to follow. "What happened?" Jack asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Ruiz exhaled shakily. "They know I gave you the file," she said, pulling a chair to the desk. "I barely made it out of the precinct. Dixon's people have ears everywhere." Jack clenched his jaw, the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "So, what now? Do you have a plan, or are we just running in circles?" Ruiz hesitated before reaching into her bag and pulling out a second file. "This isn't just about Dixon anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The higher-ups, the ones funding him, they're tied to an offshore account. It's a slush fund used for bribery, extortion, and worse." Jack's fingers traced the braille on the cover of the new file. "And how do we expose them without getting ourselves killed?" he asked. "That's where we'll need help," Ruiz admitted. "I've reached out to someone who's been tracking this network for years, an investigative journalist named Lisa Marks. She's taking a huge risk by meeting us, but she believes in taking these people down as much as we do." Later that evening, Jack and Ruiz met Lisa Marks in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The journalist was younger than Jack had expected, her sharp features framed by short, dark hair. She carried a leather satchel filled with notes, USB drives, and photographs. Lisa wasted no time diving into the details. "Dixon is small time compared to the people pulling the strings," she said, spreading a series of photographs on the table. "These are some of the key players, business executives, politicians, even a federal judge. They've built a system designed to protect themselves at all costs." Jack ran his fingers over the photographs, his expression grim. "And you're sure we can link them to Dixon?" Lisa nodded. "I've been working on this for years. I have documents, recordings, and whistleblower testimonies, but I've been waiting for the right moment to release it all. If we expose Dixon first, it'll create a domino effect. His arrest could force the higher-ups to scramble, and that's when we strike." Jack's mind raced as he absorbed the information. This was bigger than he had anticipated, and the risks were monumental. "What's our next move?" he asked. Lisa exchanged a glance with Ruiz. "We need to get Dixon's confession. If he implicates the people above him, we'll have enough to take this to the FBI." Jack, Ruiz, and Lisa spent the next several hours devising a plan. The goal was simple in theory, but dangerous in execution. Lure Dixon into a situation where he'd feel cornered enough to talk. Ruiz suggested using an old informant from her precinct, a man named Carlos, who had a history with Dixon and might be willing to help in exchange for immunity. The team agreed to stage the meeting at an isolated location, with Jack and Max providing backup, while Ruiz and Carlos confronted Dixon. Lisa would stay nearby, ready to document the interaction and ensure they had solid evidence. As the plan took shape, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing a dangerous game. Dixon wasn't just a criminal, he was a desperate man backed into a corner. People like that didn't go down without a fight. With the plan in place, Jack and Ruiz parted ways with Lisa, agreeing to regroup the following evening. As Jack and Max walked back to the safe house, Jack's thoughts turned to the risks ahead. He knew the stakes were high, not just for him, but for everyone involved. Max nudged Jack's leg, sensing his unease. Jack reached down to ruffle the dog's fur, a small gesture of comfort. "We'll get through this, boy," he murmured. "We always do." As they approached the safe house, Jack's phone buzzed. It was a text from Ruiz. "Change of plans. Meet me at the docks at midnight. Trust no one." Jack's heart sank as he read the message. The game was changing faster than he had anticipated, and he had no choice but to keep up. The docks at midnight were a place of shadows and whispers. The faint scent of salt water mingled with the metallic tang of rusted cargo containers. Jack stood at the edge of the pier, his posture rigid. Max sat by his side, his ears twitching at every creak and groan of the old wooden boards beneath their feet. Jack's mind was a whirlwind of questions. Why the sudden change of plans? What had Ruiz discovered that warranted such urgency, and could he trust her completely? The stakes had climbed too high for mistakes or misplaced trust. A pair of headlights sliced through the darkness, the hum of an engine growing louder as a black sedan approached. Jack tensed, his hand resting lightly on Max's harness. When the car stopped, Detective Ruiz stepped out, her face drawn and pale under the glow of a single dockside lamp. "Jack," she called softly, glancing around the deserted docks. "Over here." Jack approached cautiously, Max moving in perfect sync with him. "What's going on, Ruiz? This better not be a trap." Ruiz shook her head, her expression grave. "It's worse than we thought. Dixon's men are onto us. They've put a price on your head, and mine." Jack felt a cold chill run down his spine. "How did they find out?" "I don't know," Ruiz admitted. "But the journalist, Lisa, she's in danger too. They tried to ambush her an hour ago. She barely escaped and is now in hiding." Jack clenched his fists, his frustration mounting. "So, what's the play? Do we run? Or do we fight back?" Ruiz hesitated, then opened the trunk of her car. Inside was a duffel bag filled with weapons, burner phones. "If we don't act now, Dixon's going to slip through our fingers. He's planning to leave the country tomorrow morning." Jack's brow furrowed. "What's your plan?" "We force his hand," Ruiz said. "We know where he's meeting his associates tonight, a warehouse on the south side. If we can corner him there and get him to talk, we can expose the entire network. But it's risky and we'll be outnumbered." Jack's mind raced. The idea of storming a warehouse filled with armed men was a gamble, but letting Dixon escape was unthinkable. His resolve hardened as he looked down at Max, who was watching Ruiz intently. "You're asking me to walk into a death trap," Jack said finally. "But if it means stopping Dixon, I'm in. Max and I will cover you." As they prepared for the operation, Jack felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Ruiz handed him a small earpiece and a pistol, her expression a mix of determination and guilt. "I know I'm asking a lot," she said quietly. "But we don't have anyone else to trust." Jack nodded, his voice low. "This isn't about you or me, Ruiz. It's about justice. It's about making sure no one else suffers because of people like Dixon." For a moment, the two shared a solemn understanding. They were both risking everything, careers, lives, reputations, for a cause that might not even succeed. As they drove toward the warehouse, Ruiz briefed Jack on the layout and their plan. "Max will be crucial," she said. "His training could give us the edge we need." Jack reached down to scratch Max behind the ears. "He's more than just a dog," Jack said softly. "He's my partner, my eyes when I can't see, and he's never let me down." Ruiz smiled faintly. "Good, because tonight we'll need all the help we can get." The warehouse loomed ahead, its corrugated metal walls reflecting the faint glow of distant city lights. Jack and Ruiz parked their car a safe distance away and approached on foot, Max leading the way with his nose low to the ground. They paused at the edge of a shipping container yard, the warehouse's entrance in sight. "Dixon's in there," Ruiz whispered, pointing to a row of SUVs parked outside. "We need to get him alone." Jack's jaw tightened. "Let's make it count." Ruiz moved stealthily toward the warehouse, signaling for Jack and Max to follow. The air was thick with tension as they positioned themselves outside a side entrance. Inside, the murmur of voices and the occasional clang of metal echoed through the cavernous space. Jack listened intently, his other senses sharpening in the absence of sight. He could hear Dixon's distinct voice, barking orders at his men. The man was confident, too confident for someone about to be cornered. Ruiz gave Jack a nod, her hand on the door handle. "Ready?" she mouthed. Jack gripped Max's harness, his heart pounding. "Let's do this." The door creaked open just enough for Jack, Ekin, Max, and Ruiz to slip inside. The warehouse interior was dimly lit, shadows dancing across the walls from the swinging overhead lights. The air smelled of oil, rust, and cigarette smoke, punctuated by the faint buzz of fluorescent fixtures. The tension was palpable. Dixon's voice cut through the murmur of his men. "This shipment needs to disappear by dawn. No mistakes, or you'll regret it." His tone was cold, commanding, a stark reminder of the power he wielded. Jack crouched low, relying on Max's subtle movements to guide him. The dog's training shone through, every step was silent, every pause deliberate. Ruiz followed close behind, her eyes scanning for threats. They edged closer to the source of the voices. Jack could make out at least 4 distinct figures, their silhouettes visible through the slats of a stack of crates. Dixon stood near a table covered in documents, his bodyguards flanking him. Ruiz leaned toward Jack, her whisper barely audible. We need him to incriminate himself. If we just storm in, it'll be his word against ours." Jack nodded. "Then let's give him enough rope to hang himself." Ruiz gestured toward a row of stacked barrels to their left. "If we can get closer to that corner, I can record his conversation. You stay here with Max. Be ready if things go south." Jack hesitated. He hated the idea of Ruiz putting herself in danger, but he understood the necessity. "Be careful," he said, his voice low but firm. Ruiz gave a tight nod and slipped into the shadows, her movements as fluid as a predator stalking its prey. Jack stayed behind, his hand resting on Max's harness. The dog remained alert, his ears swiveling to catch every sound. As Ruiz moved into position, Dixon's tone shifted. "We've got a leak," he said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "One of you idiots let something slip, and now I've got cops sniffing around." Jack stiffened, his grip on Max tightening. Ruiz paused, pressing herself against the side of a crate. Her phone was in her hand. The screen dimmed as she recorded every word. Dixon continued, "If I find out who's responsible, they'll wish they'd never been born. Until then, we stick to the plan. The shipment leaves tonight, no matter what." One of the bodyguards spoke up. "What about that journalist? She's still a problem." Dixon laughed coldly. "Not for long. I've got someone taking care of her as we speak." Ruiz's eyes widened at the revelation. She glanced back at Jack, her expression urgent. Jack couldn't see her, but he could sense the shift in her energy. Something had changed. Max let out a low growl, almost imperceptible, but enough to make Jack tense. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Before Ruiz could relay what she'd heard, the situation took a sudden turn. One of Dixon's men, a wiry figure with sharp features, started moving toward the area where Ruiz was hiding. "Hey, did you hear that?" the man said, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. Ruiz froze, her body pressed against the crate. She held her breath, willing herself to remain unseen. Jack's pulse quickened. He could sense the impending danger. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. Max shifted slightly, his body taut and ready. The man rounded the corner, his flashlight sweeping over the crates. Ruiz ducked just in time, the beam narrowly missing her. But as she moved, her foot brushed against a loose piece of metal, sending it clattering to the ground. "Who's there?" the man barked, drawing his weapon. Ruiz bolted, making a beeline for Jack and Max. The man shouted, alerting the others. Dixon turned, his eyes narrowing as he grabbed a pistol from the table. "Find them!" he snarled, "and don't let them leave this warehouse alive!" The quiet tension exploded into chaos. Dixon's men spread out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Jack knew they couldn't rely on stealth any longer. "Max, go!" Jack commanded, releasing the dog. Max sprang into action, his powerful frame darting toward the nearest assailant. The man barely had time to react before Max knocked him to the ground, his growl echoing through the warehouse. Jack followed Ruiz's hurried footsteps, his cane tapping lightly as he navigated the chaotic scene. "Ruiz, where are you?" "Here," she called, her voice cutting through the noise. She grabbed Jack's arm, guiding him toward a stack of metal barrels. "We're outnumbered, Jack. We need backup." Jack clenched his jaw. "We don't have time to wait. If Dixon gets away, this whole operation is for nothing." As the chaos unfolded, Dixon made his move. He slipped through a side door, flanked by his remaining bodyguards. Ruiz saw him and cursed under her breath. "He's running!" Jack turned his head toward the sound of the door slamming shut. "Max," he called. The dog responded immediately, racing back to his side. "We're going after him," Jack said, his tone brooking no argument. Ruiz hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Let's end this." Jack, Ruiz, and Max bolted toward the side door Dixon had used for his escape. The warehouse erupted in pandemonium as Dixon's remaining men scrambled to maintain control. Flashlights and shouts ricocheted across the cavernous space, but Jack and Ruiz stayed focused on their target. Bursting through the door, the trio found themselves in an alleyway, bathed in the eerie glow of a flickering streetlight. The air was thick with the smell of damp asphalt and oil, and the distant hum of the city provided a tense backdrop. Jack gripped Max's harness tightly. "Which way?" he asked, his tone urgent. Ruiz scanned the area, her sharp eyes catching a glimpse of taillights disappearing around a corner. "Over there," she said, tugging Jack's arm. "He's getting into a car." Max let out a low bark, already straining to follow the scent of their quarry. Jack trusted his companion implicitly. "Lead the way, Max." The dog surged forward, his powerful strides pulling Jack along as Ruiz ran beside them. The group rounded the corner just in time to see Dixon's sleek black SUV speeding down the road. As they reached the main street, a familiar voice called out from behind them. "You two need a ride." Jack and Ruiz turned to see Officer Daniels, his cruiser parked haphazardly at the curb. He had heard the commotion over the radio and come to assist. Ruiz didn't hesitate. "Yes, Dixon's trying to get away." "Get in," Daniels shouted, throwing open the car doors. Jack and Max climbed into the back seat, while Ruiz slid into the front. Daniels hit the gas, the tires screeching as the cruiser lurched forward. Dixon's SUV weaved through traffic, its driver making reckless turns in an attempt to lose them. Daniels stayed close, expertly navigating the streets. Ruiz gripped the dashboard, her eyes locked on the vehicle ahead. "He's heading toward the industrial district," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Jack leaned forward, his hand resting on Max's back for reassurance. "We can't let him disappear into those warehouses. He'll vanish for good." Daniels nodded grimly. "Hold on, this is about to get rough." He swerved sharply, cutting through an intersection just as the light turned red. Horns blared, but the cruiser stayed on Dixon's tail. Max growled softly, his keen senses attuned to the rising tension. As they closed in on the industrial district, Dixon's driver made a desperate move. The SUV veered onto a narrow side street, its tires skidding on the wet pavement. Daniels followed, the cruiser's sirens wailing through the night. The chase led them deeper into a labyrinth of abandoned factories and loading docks. The area was eerily quiet, the shadows deep and foreboding. Dixon's SUV came to a sudden stop, and the doors flew open. Dixon and his bodyguard spilled out, taking cover behind a row of rusted containers. Daniels killed the engine and turned to Ruiz. "This is where it gets tricky. Are you armed?" Ruiz nodded, pulling a compact pistol from her holster. "Always." Jack tightened his grip on Max's harness. "We've got this. Max can flush them out." Daniels hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful." Ruiz and Daniels took cover behind a stack of pallets, their weapons drawn. Jack crouched low, his hand brushing against Max's fur. The dog was vibrating with energy, ready to act. Jack gave a low command. "Find Dixon." Max moved like a shadow, his training evident in every step. He darted between the containers, his keen nose leading him straight to the group. One of Dixon's bodyguards spotted him and shouted, raising his weapon. Before he could fire, Max lunged, his powerful jaws locking onto the man's arm. Ruiz seized the opportunity, stepping out of cover to disarm the bodyguard with a precise shot to his shoulder. The man crumpled, his weapon clattering to the ground. Dixon shouted orders, his voice frantic. "Fall back! Get to the docks!" Jack, guided by Max's signals, advanced cautiously. He could hear Dixon's panicked breathing, the sound of footsteps retreating over gravel. "You're running out of places to hide, Dixon," Jack called out. "It's over." As Ruiz and Daniels moved to cut off Dixon's escape, he made a last-ditch attempt to negotiate. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice echoing through the industrial maze. "This isn't just about me. If I go down, I'm taking a lot of people with me." Ruiz scoffed. "You think that scares us? You're going down either way." Dixon laughed bitterly. "You're chasing me, but you don't even know the half of it. That file I destroyed? It wasn't just evidence. It was a list of everyone involved. Politicians, CEOs, people you'd never dream of accusing." Ruiz paused, her grip tightening on her weapon. Jack furrowed his brow, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "He's stalling," Jack said. "Don't let him distract you." But Ruiz couldn't shake the weight of Dixon's words. If he was telling the truth, their mission had just become much more complicated. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Dixon's words hung in the air, casting doubt and sowing unease. Ruiz's mind raced, weighing the implications of what he had said. Could there really be a network of powerful individuals shielding him? And if so, how far would they go to protect their secrets? While Ruiz and Daniels processed the gravity of Dixon's revelation, Max had not faltered. His keen nose followed Dixon's scent, leading Jack through the maze of containers and rusting machinery. Jack relied on the subtle tugs of Max's harness, his senses heightened by years of training with the dog. "Max, steady," Jack whispered as they rounded a corner. The faint sound of gravel crunching underfoot signaled they were close. Jack could feel Dixon's desperation in the air, a predator cornered and ready to lash out. Ahead, Dixon stopped abruptly, realizing he had no clear escape route. He turned, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and fear, and leveled a gun in Jack's direction. "Stay back," Dixon barked, his voice trembling. "I'll shoot, don't think I won't." Jack froze, his hand instinctively tightening on Max's harness. "Dixon, you're out of options," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "Put the weapon down. This doesn't have to end badly." Dixon laughed bitterly. "You think you've won? You don't know what you're up against. If you think taking me down will solve anything, you're more naive than I thought." Before Jack could respond, Ruiz emerged from the shadows, her weapon trained on Dixon. "Drop it, Dixon," she commanded. "We've got you surrounded." Dixon's eyes darted between Jack and Ruiz, calculating his next move. "You're making a mistake," he sneered. "You take me in, and they'll bury this whole thing. You'll be lucky if you keep your jobs. Better to take that chance than let you walk," Ruiz retorted. "Now drop the gun." Dixon hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. Max growled low, his body tense and ready to strike. Jack could feel the vibration of Max's energy and knew the dog was waiting for the command to act. The standoff stretched into agonizing seconds. Dixon's hand wavered, his resolve crumbling under the weight of the situation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm not the worst of them. If you take me out, you'll be opening Pandora's box." Ruiz didn't flinch. "We'll deal with that when the time comes. Right now, you're the problem in front of me. Last chance." Dixon dropped the gun. Dixon's shoulders sagged, his bravado finally giving way to defeat. Slowly, he lowered the weapon and let it clatter to the ground. Ruiz moved in swiftly, kicking the gun away and securing him in handcuffs. "You've made the right choice," she said, though her voice was devoid of sympathy. "But don't think for a second that you're walking out of this clean." As Ruiz and Daniels led Dixon back toward the waiting squad cars, he smirked. "You think this is over? It's just beginning. The people I work for, they'll come for you. And when they do, you'll wish you'd left me in that warehouse." Ruiz tightened her grip on Dixon's arm. "Let them come. We'll be ready." Jack remained quiet, his mind churning with questions. Dixon's cryptic warnings hinted at a larger conspiracy, one that could have far-reaching consequences. For now, though, they had secured their target. Max stayed close to Jack's side, his presence a steadying force. Jack knelt down, running his hand over Max's head. "Good work, buddy," he murmured. The dog nuzzled against him, his tail wagging softly. Despite the chaos, Max had done what he was trained to do: protect and assist. Ruiz glanced over at Jack. "We couldn't have done this without Max," she said. "He's incredible." Jack smiled faintly. "He's more than that. He's my partner." As the team secured Dixon in a police vehicle, Ruiz's phone buzzed with a message from the forensic team. "We've recovered the destroyed documents from the warehouse," the message read. "Several pages are salvageable. Looks like there's a list of names." Ruiz showed the message to Jack, her expression grim. Dixon wasn't lying. "There's a bigger game at play here." Jack nodded, his jaw set. "Then we play to win." The squad cars pulled away from the warehouse district, their flashing lights casting long shadows across the abandoned buildings. Dixon sat in the back of one vehicle, his cuffed hands resting in his lap, an unsettling smirk playing on his lips. It was the expression of a man who knew secrets and enjoyed holding them over others. Ruiz rode in the car ahead of him, her mind swirling with thoughts about the evidence recovered and Dixon's cryptic warnings. She glanced at her phone, rereading the forensic team's message about the names found in the documents. Each name represented a potential piece of a much larger puzzle. "If Dixon's telling the truth," she muttered to herself, "this could blow everything wide open." In another car, Jack sat quietly with Max at his side. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the road was a stark contrast to the adrenaline-fueled chaos of the chase. He rested his hand on Max's harness, drawing comfort from the dog's steady presence. Jack's thoughts drifted to Dixon's taunts about the corrupt system protecting him. "We've taken him down, Max," Jack said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "But what if that's just the start? How deep does this go?" Max responded with a low, reassuring whine, as if to say, "We'll handle it together." The convoy was halfway to the police precinct when the lead car's radio crackled with an urgent alert. "Roadblock ahead. Unmarked vehicles reported in the area. Proceed with caution." Ruiz's stomach tightened. "This isn't right," she said to the driver. "Who ordered the roadblock?" Before the officer could respond, a black van screeched into view, cutting off the convoy. Simultaneously, two other vehicles blocked them from behind, trapping them in a narrow stretch of road. Men in tactical gear poured out of the vans, their faces obscured by masks. They moved with military precision, weapons drawn. "It's an ambush," Ruiz shouted, drawing her weapon. "Protect Dixon, he's their target." The officers scrambled to form a defensive perimeter around the vehicles, but the attackers were well coordinated and heavily armed. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing in the confined space. Jack crouched low, his hand firmly on Max's harness. "Stay down, boy," he whispered. "We're not done yet." Ruiz took charge, barking orders to the officers while returning fire. She moved with calculated precision, her mind focused on one objective: keeping Dixon alive. If these men were here to silence him, it meant his information was more valuable than they'd realized. Amidst the chaos, Jack knew they needed an edge. "Max, search," he commanded, releasing the dog. Max darted into action, his sharp instincts cutting through the confusion. He weaved between cars and attackers, his low growl a warning to anyone in his path. One of the assailants spotted Max and aimed his weapon, but the dog was too quick. With a powerful leap, Max latched onto the man's arm, forcing him to drop the gun. The commotion provided Ruiz with an opening to neutralize the attacker with a well-placed shot. In the midst of the firefight, Dixon saw an opportunity. With the officers distracted, he slipped out of the back seat and began running toward the woods lining the road. His hands were still cuffed, but his desperation drove him forward. Ruiz caught sight of him and cursed under her breath. "Dixon's making a run for it," she shouted. "Jack, can you—" "On it," Jack interrupted, already in motion. "Max, after him." Max took off like a missile, his training kicking in as he tracked Dixon's scent through the underbrush. Jack followed, guided by Max's movements and the sounds of branches snapping underfoot. Dixon stumbled through the dense forest, his breathing ragged. He tripped over a fallen log, landing hard on the ground. Before he could get up, Max appeared, standing over him with a low, menacing growl. Dixon froze, his eyes wide with fear. "Call him off!" Dixon shouted, his voice cracking. "I'll talk, I'll tell you everything." Jack emerged moments later, his figure silhouetted against the moonlight filtering through the trees. He held his cane in one hand, his other resting on Max's back. "You had your chance to cooperate, Dixon," Jack said, his voice steady. "Now it's on our terms." Dixon's bravado crumbled. Okay, just get this dog away from me." Jack gave a command, and Max backed off slightly, his watchful gaze never leaving Dixon. Ruiz arrived shortly after, her gun drawn. "Don't move," she said sharply, cuffing Dixon's ankles for good measure. Back on the road, the ambush had been neutralized. Officers secured the attackers, their vans, and the weapons cache they'd brought. Ruiz radioed for backup to extract them from the area safely. When Jack and Ruiz returned with Dixon, the defeated man muttered under his breath, "You don't know what you're dealing with. This isn't over." Ruiz smirked. "You're right, Dixon. It's just getting started." The convoy arrived at the police precinct under heavy security. Despite the reinforcements, tension lingered in the air. Officers surrounded the area, their eyes scanning for any sign of additional threats. Dixon, now thoroughly subdued, was escorted inside, his smirk replaced by a grim expression. Jack stood beside Ruiz, his hand resting on Max's harness. The dog, though calm, remained alert, his ears perked as if sensing that the danger wasn't entirely over. Ruiz glanced at Jack. "We've got him. But this isn't the end," she said, her voice laced with determination. "If Dixon's network is as extensive as he claims, this might just be the tip of the iceberg." Jack nodded. "That's why we have to play this smart. He's scared now, which means we've got leverage." Inside the interrogation room, Dixon sat across from Ruiz and another detective, his cuffed hands resting on the cold steel table. Jack and Max observed from behind the one-way glass, the former officer's ears tuned to every word. Ruiz leaned forward, her tone sharp but composed. "Let's cut the games, Dixon. You're facing charges that will bury you, but we both know you're not the mastermind here. Help us dismantle this operation, and we might be able to cut you a deal." Dixon scoffed, his eyes darting nervously. "You think you can just take them down? You have no idea how powerful they are. They'll come for me, and for you." Ruiz didn't flinch. "Let them try. We're not the ones in handcuffs. You have one chance to cooperate." Dixon hesitated, the weight of his predicament evident in his slumped shoulders. After a long pause, he began to speak, his voice low and cautious. He named names, detailed operations, and described safe houses and covert communication methods. Ruiz's pen moved furiously across her notebook, capturing every detail. Behind the glass, Jack listened intently. His mind raced with memories of the cases he'd worked, connections forming like puzzle pieces. Max rested his head on Jack's lap, a grounding presence amidst the storm of information. As the interrogation continued, Dixon dropped a bombshell. "There's a list," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A list of officials on their payroll, judges, politicians, even cops. That's how they stay untouchable." Ruiz froze mid-note, her eyes narrowing. "Where's the list?" Dixon hesitated again, then muttered, "It's encrypted on a drive hidden in my apartment, but you'll never get to it. They'll destroy it before you even set foot in the building." Ruiz didn't miss a beat. She stood abruptly and strode out of the room, her jaw tight with resolve. Jack met her in the hallway, Max at his side. "We need that drive," she said. "But he's right. They'll try to destroy it before we get there." Jack straightened, a flicker of his old determination reigniting. "Then we don't give them the chance." A team was quickly assembled, including Jack, Ruiz, and a squad of officers. As they sped toward Dixon's apartment, the weight of the mission pressed heavily on them. Every second mattered. Ruiz briefed the team en route. "We're dealing with professionals. Expect resistance, and prioritize securing the drive. If what Dixon says is true, this could blow their entire operation wide open." Jack listened, his mind focused. Despite his blindness, he had years of experience navigating high-stakes situations. Max sensed his handler's resolve and sat alert, ready for action. When they arrived at Dixon's upscale apartment complex, it was eerily quiet. The team moved in with practiced precision, clearing rooms and securing the perimeter. Jack and Max stayed near Ruiz, their combined instincts making them an effective unit. As they reached Dixon's apartment, the door was ajar, a clear sign that someone had been there. Ruiz signaled for caution, and the team entered in formation. Inside, the place was ransacked, papers and furniture strewn across the floor. Max suddenly tensed, his nose twitching. Jack felt the shift and whispered, "He's onto something." Max led them to a hidden panel in the wall, scratching at it urgently. Ruiz pried it open, revealing a small safe. "Bingo," she said, pulling out a laptop and an external drive. Before they could celebrate, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. Shots rang out, and the team ducked for cover. 2 armed men had been lying in wait, determined to protect the secrets Dixon had promised. Jack crouched low, his hand on Max's harness. "Stay down," he murmured, his voice calm but firm. Max obeyed, his body tense and ready. Ruiz returned fire, her sharp aim taking out one assailant. The second man charged toward her, but Max sprang into action, intercepting him with a ferocious growl. The man faltered, giving Ruiz enough time to subdue him. With the attackers neutralized, the team secured the drive and laptop. Ruiz turned to Jack, a rare smile breaking through her serious demeanor. "We did it," she said. "This could be the break we've been waiting for." Jack nodded, his hand resting on Max's head. "It's not over yet, but it's a start." As the convoy arrived safely back at the precinct, the tension in the air was palpable. Officers moved quickly to secure Dixon, ensuring he couldn't pull any more surprises. Ruiz and Jack stood in the holding area, watching as the once smirking informant was led into an interrogation room. Jack tightened his grip on Max's harness, feeling the weight of what Dixon represented. The man wasn't just a criminal, he was the key to unraveling a web of corruption that reached far beyond their small team. Ruiz placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We've got him," she said. "Now we make him talk." Inside the interrogation room, Dixon leaned back in his chair, his cuffs clinking against the metal table. Despite his earlier fear, his smugness had returned. "You know," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "I could make things very easy for you. All I want is one thing in return." Ruiz raised an eyebrow, her arms crossed. "You're not exactly in a position to negotiate." Dixon chuckled. "A man in my position always has leverage. You want the names, the accounts, the evidence? Fine, but I want immunity and witness protection, full stop." Ruiz stepped out of the room, joining Jack in the observation area. She let out a frustrated sigh. "He's not going to budge without a deal. And honestly, Jack, if what he says checks out, it might be worth it. This could bring down some very powerful people." Jack shook his head, his expression unreadable behind his dark glasses. And what happens to the victims? Ruiz. The ones he put there. If we let him walk, how do we justify that? Ruiz hesitated. I don't like it any more than you do. But we're talking about systemic corruption. Dixon might be the only way to expose it. Sometimes justice has to be strategic. Jack turned toward her, his voice calm but firm. Justice isn't justice if we compromise its integrity. If we let him walk, we're no better than the system we're trying to fix. The debate was interrupted by a knock at the door. An officer entered, holding a file. Detective Ruiz, we finished analyzing the documents from the ambush. You're going to want to see this. Ruiz flipped through the pages, her face growing more serious with each revelation. These are financial records, she muttered. And this is a list of accomplices. Jack's ears perked up. What kind of accomplices? Ruiz looked up, her expression grim. Judges, politicians, even high-ranking law enforcement. This isn't just a local problem, Jack. It's national. Jack nodded slowly. Then we have to handle this carefully. If Dixon knows we have this, he might try to destroy what's left of the evidence. As they prepared to re-enter the interrogation room, Max suddenly tensed at Jack's side, letting out a low growl. Jack's hand shot out, signaling for silence. What is it, boy? He whispered. Max tugged on his harness, leading Jack toward the hallway. Ruiz followed, her hand instinctively resting on her weapon. The dog stopped in front of a utility closet, his nose pressed against the door. Ruiz frowned, signaling to two nearby officers. Open it. When the door swung open, they found a maintenance worker inside, fumbling with a small device. His eyes widened in panic as he dropped the object and bolted. Ruiz gave chase while Jack knelt to inspect the device. It's a burner phone, he said. Max must have smelled the residue. Ruiz returned moments later, dragging the suspect back. Caught him trying to call someone, she said. Probably to warn Dixon. Armed with the new evidence and the intercepted call, Ruiz and Jack re-entered the interrogation room. Dixon's smirk faltered when he saw their determined expressions. You're running out of options, Ruiz said, tossing the file onto the table. We know about the judges, the cops, everyone. You're not the only one who can give us answers? Dixon leaned back, trying to mask his unease. You don't have enough to bring them down without me. Jack stepped forward, his tone ice cold. We have enough to bring you down. The question is whether you want to go down alone. For the first time, Dixon looked genuinely worried. His bravado cracked under the weight of their combined pressure. Fine, he said through gritted teeth, but I'm not saying another word without a deal. As Dixon began to talk, his information painted a grim picture of corruption and conspiracy. Ruiz documented everything, her pen flying across the page. But the revelations came with a price. The names he mentioned were powerful, and once they realized he was talking, they would stop at nothing to silence him and anyone who stood in their way. Jack and Ruiz knew the clock was ticking. They had to move quickly to secure the evidence and protect their team. We're going to need federal backup, Ruiz said, dialing her phone. This is bigger than us, Jack nodded. And we'll need to keep Dixon alive long enough to make it count. Just as Ruiz and Jack finalized their plans to transport Dixon to a secure federal facility, a sudden commotion erupted in the precinct. The lights flickered, and the unmistakable sound of gunfire echoed from the main entrance. Officers scrambled to respond, their radios crackling with frantic updates. Jack instinctively crouched, his hand tightening on Max's harness. What's going on? He asked, his tone sharp. Ruiz peeked out into the hallway, her face pale. We're under attack. Someone doesn't want Dixon leaving this building. Jack's jaw tightened. We can't let them get to him. He's the only way to expose this network. As officers formed a defensive perimeter, Max's ears perked up. He tugged at Jack's harness, signaling an imminent threat. Jack trusted the dog's instincts without hesitation. What is it, boy? He asked. Following Max's lead, the dog led Jack and Ruiz toward the interrogation room where Dixon was being held. They found two armed men attempting to force the door open. Before they could react, Max lunged, his powerful jaws locking onto one assailant's arm. The man screamed, dropping his weapon. Ruiz raised her gun, her aim steady. Freeze! She barked, forcing the second man to surrender. The remaining officers secured the area, but the message was clear. This attack was only the beginning. We need to move Dixon now, Ruiz said, her voice urgent. They won't stop until he's dead. Jack nodded. Agreed. But we need a distraction. If they know we're moving him, they'll follow. Max stood by Jack's side, his tail wagging slightly as if ready for the challenge. Jack reached down, giving the dog a reassuring pat. "Looks like it's up to us, boy." The plan was simple but risky. A decoy vehicle would leave the precinct with a police escort, drawing the attacker's attention. Meanwhile, Jack, Ruiz, and Max would take Dixon through an underground tunnel leading to an unmarked van waiting at the other end. The decoy worked like a charm. The attackers followed the heavily guarded convoy, leaving the precinct eerily quiet. Jack and Ruiz led Dixon through the dimly lit tunnel, Max alert and ready for anything, but their relief was short-lived. Halfway through the tunnel, Max froze, growling low in his throat. Jack stopped abruptly. "What is it, Max?" A shadow moved ahead of them, followed by the metallic click of a weapon being cocked. "Looks like the party came to us," a voice sneered. Ruiz and Jack reacted instantly, taking cover behind the tunnel's concrete walls. Dixon cowered, his bravado replaced by sheer terror. As bullets ricocheted off the walls, Max sprang into action. The dog darted into the fray, his agility and training making him a blur of motion. He tackled one assailant, disarming him with a swift, calculated bite. The distraction gave Ruiz and Jack the opening they needed to neutralize the remaining threats. When the dust settled, Max returned to Jack's side, his tail wagging triumphantly despite a small graze on his flank. Jack knelt down, his hands trembling as he checked the wound. "You're a hero, Max," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The team finally emerged from the tunnel, battered but victorious. The unmarked van was waiting, its engine running. They loaded Dixon inside, securing him for the journey to the federal facility. As the van sped away, Ruiz turned to Jack. "We did it. He's safe for now." Jack nodded, his hand resting on Max's head. "We're not out of the woods yet, but this is a start." During the ride, Dixon began to talk, his fear of his pursuers outweighing his loyalty to them. He provided names, locations, and bank accounts, each revelation painting a darker picture of corruption. Ruiz documented everything, her pen flying across the page. Jack listened intently, his thoughts racing. "If even half of this is true," he said, "it's enough to bring down an empire." Hours later, the team arrived at the federal facility. Dixon was placed in protective custody, his information immediately relayed to a task force. The weight of the day's events began to lift as Jack and Ruiz realized the impact of their actions. As they prepared to leave, an agent approached them, his expression solemn. "Your work today saved lives," he said. "We'll take it from here." Back at the precinct, Max was hailed as a hero. Officers gathered to celebrate the dog's bravery, showering him with treats and affection. Jack stood to the side, a rare smile gracing his face. "He earned it," Jack said softly to Ruiz. "He always does." The drive back to Jack's modest apartment was subdued, the adrenaline of the day finally giving way to exhaustion. Max sat in the passenger seat, his head resting on Jack's lap, the dog's calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. Jack reached down, running his fingers through Max's fur. "You never let me down, do you, buddy?" he murmured. Max responded with a soft wag of his tail, his loyalty unwavering. Ruiz's voice broke the silence. "Jack, you did something incredible today. You put your life on the line, not just for justice, but for everyone in that precinct." Jack gave a small nod, his face contemplative. "I couldn't have done it without Max. He's the real hero." The following morning, Jack received an unexpected call from the precinct. Ruiz's voice was filled with excitement. "Jack, you need to get down here now." Reluctantly, Jack agreed, curiosity piqued. He and Max arrived at the station, where a crowd of officers and reporters greeted them. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and pride. Chief Ramirez stood at the center of the gathering, holding a plaque. "Jack, Max, this department owes you a debt of gratitude," he began. "Your actions yesterday not only ensured justice, but also saved countless lives." He gestured for Jack and Max to join him. The crowd erupted into applause as the plaque was presented, a commendation for bravery and exceptional service. The commendation ceremony wasn't just about Jack's heroism. Max was the star of the event. Officers shared stories of his past exploits, each one a testament to the dog's intelligence, courage, and unwavering loyalty. As Jack stood by, listening to the accolades, he realized how much Max had shaped his life. "He's not just my partner," Jack said when asked to speak. "He's my family, and yesterday he reminded me that even when the odds are against you, there's always a way to fight back." In the days that followed, Jack and Max became local heroes. Their story made headlines, shining a light on the importance of police dogs and their handlers. The community rallied around them, with offers of support pouring in. One such offer came from a rehabilitation center for retired police and military dogs. They invited Jack and Max to visit, proposing a partnership to help train the next generation of canine heroes. For Jack, it was an opportunity to turn his struggles into something meaningful. "Max and I have been through a lot," he told Ruiz. "If we can help others find their way, it'll all be worth it." One afternoon, while walking Max in the park, Jack was approached by a young boy and his mother. The boy hesitated before speaking. "Is this the dog from the news?" he asked, his eyes wide with wonder. Jack smiled. "Yes, this is Max." The boy crouched down, petting Max gently. "He's so brave. I want to be brave like him." Jack's chest tightened, emotion welling up at the boy's words. "You can be," he said softly. "So it just takes a lot of heart, and maybe a little help from a friend." As the sun set that evening, Jack sat on his porch, Max at his side. The city skyline shimmered in the distance, a reminder of the world they had fought so hard to protect. Jack took a deep breath, the weight of the past finally lifting. He had found a new purpose, one that went beyond his badge or his blindness. With Max by his side, there was nothing he couldn't face. Jack and Max's story is one of resilience, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, courage and compassion can light the way forward. If you were inspired by their journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories. And remember, sometimes the greatest heroes walk on four legs. See you in the next one.